The most wicked men ever known. From biblical times. The first one on the list is Cain. Cain, the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, is one of the most notorious figures in the Bible for committing the first murder. His story is found in Genesis chapter 4, and it highlights not only the gravity of his actions, but also his deeply flawed character, which reflected an unchecked descent into wickedness. Cain's evil began with jealousy toward his younger brother Abel. Both Cain and Abel brought offerings to the Lord. Cain, a farmer, offered fruits of the soil, while Abel, a shepherd, offered the firstborn of his flock. God accepted Abel's offering because it was given in faith and was the best of what Abel had. However, Cain's offering was rejected, most likely because it was given with the wrong heart and not from his best produce. Instead of self-reflection or repentance, Cain's jealousy of his brother consumed him. Cain allowed his bitterness and envy to grow into rage. God even warned him, saying, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Ignoring this warning, Cain lured Abel into the field and killed him in cold blood. This act marked the first murder in human history, revealing how deep his wickedness had become. Cain displayed further evil by attempting to lie to God. When God asked him where Abel was, Cain arrogantly responded, "Am I my brother's keeper?" This showed not only his refusal to take responsibility for his crime, but also a rebellious attitude towards God's authority. Even when God confronted Cain with his crime and declared his punishment, Cain expressed no real remorse for his actions. Instead, he complained about the severity of his punishment, saying, "My punishment is more than I can bear." His concern was not for the wrong he had done, but for the consequences he would face. Cain's jealousy of Abel's favor with God led him to commit murder. This story highlights how unchecked jealousy can escalate into harmful actions. The Bible advises against jealousy, as seen in Proverbs 14:30, which states, "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." The message is clear. Unchecked jealousy can corrupt one's inner peace and lead to personal destruction. Focusing on what you have and appreciating your own life can help diminish feelings of jealousy. Practicing gratitude for your own successes and relationships can foster contentment and reduce comparison with others. Number 2 on the wicked list is the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Pharaoh of Egypt, in the biblical story of the Exodus, is one of the most infamous villains in the Bible. His cruelty, arrogance, and defiance against God led to one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power and judgment through the 10 plagues. Although his name is never explicitly mentioned, Pharaoh's actions reveal a deeply hardened heart and a brutal determination to maintain control over the Israelites. The Pharaoh of Exodus was the ruler of Egypt at a time when the Israelites were living in Egypt, having originally migrated there during the time of Joseph. Over the centuries, the Israelites multiplied greatly, and the new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph and became fearful of their growing numbers. He saw the Israelites as a threat and decided to enslave them to control their population and use them as labor for his building projects. His oppressive rule was marked by cruelty, as the Israelites were forced into harsh, grueling labor under brutal conditions. In a particularly evil decree, Pharaoh ordered the systematic killing of all male Hebrew babies. Fearing that the Israelites would become too powerful, he commanded the Hebrew midwives to kill any male child at birth. When the midwives disobeyed out of fear of God, Pharaoh issued a more public and ruthless order, commanding that every Hebrew baby boy be thrown into the Nile River. This act of genocide set the stage for Moses' survival, as his mother placed him in a basket to save him from Pharaoh's decree, leading to his adoption by Pharaoh's own daughter. Defiance against God. When Moses returned to Egypt, commanded by God to free the Israelites, he confronted Pharaoh with God's message, "Let my people go." However, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he refused, claiming ignorance of Yahweh, the God of Israel. His defiance wasn't merely a personal rejection of Moses' request, but a direct challenge to God's authority. Pharaoh, who considered himself a living deity, saw no reason to obey a foreign god. Instead of listening, he increased the Israelites' workload, making their oppression even harsher. In response to Pharaoh's refusal, God sent 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, These plagues were not only judgments on Pharaoh's stubbornness, but also an attack on the Egyptian gods, demonstrating that the God of Israel was the one true God. Each time a plague struck Egypt, Pharaoh's heart grew harder, even though the plagues caused immense suffering to the Egyptian people. The 10 plagues were: first, God turned the waters of the Nile River and all other bodies of water in Egypt into blood. The fish died and the river stank, making it impossible for the Egyptians to drink the water. This was a blow to Egypt's primary water source and economy, as the Nile was essential for drinking, agriculture and fishing. Second plague, God caused a plague of frogs to swarm the land. Frogs entered homes, bedrooms, kitchens and even the ovens, making life unbearable. The frogs invaded every part of life in Egypt, disrupting daily activities and causing widespread discomfort. Third plague, God commanded the dust of the earth to become gnats or lice, which swarmed over people and animals. This plague tormented both humans and livestock, making life miserable for the Egyptians. The magicians of Egypt recognized this as the finger of God. Fourth plague, swarms of flies descended upon Egypt, filling the houses of the Egyptians and covering the land, but the region of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. The flies created havoc and severe discomfort, furthering the division between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Fifth plague, God sent a severe plague on the livestock of Egypt, including horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep and goats, causing many to die. However, the livestock of the Israelites was spared. This caused a significant economic loss for Egypt, as livestock were vital for agriculture, transport and trade. Sixth plague, boils and sores broke out on both humans and animals throughout Egypt. The magicians were unable to stand before Moses because of the boils. This plague affected the health of the Egyptians, adding personal physical suffering to the national calamity. Seventh plague, God sent a storm of hail accompanied by fire, possibly lightning, that struck down people, animals and crops in the fields. The region of Goshen was again spared. The hailstorm destroyed much of Egypt's crops and livestock, causing further economic devastation. Pharaoh begged for the hail to stop, but later hardened his heart again. Eighth plague, a swarm of locusts covered the land of Egypt, consuming every remaining crop and tree that survived the hail. The locusts devastated Egypt's food supply, causing widespread famine and threatening the survival of the Egyptian people. Ninth plague, a thick darkness fell over Egypt for 3 days, so intense that the Egyptians could not see or move about, but the Israelites had light where they lived. This was a direct challenge to the Egyptian sun god Ra and demonstrated the powerlessness of Egypt's gods. The psychological impact of this plague was immense. 10th plague, God sent the final, most devastating plague, the death of all firstborn sons in Egypt, including Pharaoh's son. However, the Israelites were spared because they marked their doorposts with lamb's blood, which signaled the angel of death to pass over their homes. This final plague broke Pharaoh's resolve, and he finally agreed to let the Israelites go. It is also the basis for the Jewish festival of Passover, commemorating the Israelites' deliverance from slavery. Conclusion: the 10 plagues were significant not only as acts of judgment against Egypt, but also as demonstrations of God's power over the false gods of Egypt and his protection of the Israelites. The plagues culminated in the liberation of the Israelites and are central to the biblical narrative of Exodus. Only the Israelites, who marked their doors with lamb's blood, the Passover, were spared. Throughout the series of plagues, Pharaoh consistently refused to let the Israelites go, even after seeing the devastation caused to his land and people. The Bible frequently mentions that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, sometimes by Pharaoh himself and at other times by God. This hardening of heart symbolizes Pharaoh's pride, stubbornness, and refusal to submit to God's will, despite overwhelming evidence of God's power. After the death of the firstborn in Egypt, Pharaoh finally relented and allowed the Israelites to leave. However, his evil did not stop there. Once the Israelites had left, Pharaoh changed his mind and pursued them with his army, determined to enslave them once again. This led to one of the most famous miracles in the Bible, the parting of the Red Sea. When the Israelites crossed the sea safely, Pharaoh and his army followed, but God closed the waters, drowning Pharaoh's army. Pharaoh's pursuit of the Israelites ended in total destruction, showcasing God's ultimate victory over him. Pharaoh's reign in Exodus serves as a lasting symbol of tyranny, oppression, and defiance against God. His refusal to release the Israelites despite numerous warnings and plagues reveals a deeply prideful and wicked heart. His cruelty in enslaving the Israelites and his attempted genocide of the Hebrew male infants further demonstrates his evil nature. Pharaoh's downfall highlights the inevitable defeat of those who oppose God's purposes and mistreat his people. In the broader narrative of the Bible, Pharaoh represents human defiance, tyranny, and the consequences of rejecting God's authority. His stubbornness led not only to his own destruction, but also to immense suffering for the Egyptian people. Through this story, the Bible emphasizes the justice and power of God in delivering his people from the hands of the wicked. Number 3 on the wicked list is King Ahab. King Ahab, one of the most infamous monarchs in the Bible, was the 7th king of Israel, ruling from approximately 874 to 853 BC. His reign is described in the books of 1 Kings chapter 16, where he is depicted as a deeply wicked and corrupt king who led Israel into idolatry, immorality, and apostasy. Ahab's character and actions are intertwined with his wife Jezebel, whose influence further exacerbated his evil reign. Together, they are remembered as one of the most treacherous power couples in biblical history. Ahab's rule marked a period of profound spiritual decline for Israel. One of his most significant faults was his active promotion of Baal worship, which directly violated the first commandment forbidding the worship of other gods. Baal was a Canaanite. 1 Kings chapter 16 describes Ahab as doing more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him, largely due to his marriage to Jezebel, a Sidonian princess and a devoted worshipper of Baal. Ahab not only tolerated her influence but fully embraced it. He built altars for Baal in Samaria, erected Asherah poles, symbols of Canaanite fertility goddess worship, and turned the entire nation towards idol worship. Ahab's marriage to Jezebel was one of the most critical factors contributing to his downfall. Jezebel was not just an idolatrous foreign queen, but an aggressive promoter of Baal worship. She systematically worked to eradicate the worship of Yahweh from Israel, ordering the murder of God's prophets as mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 18. Under her influence, Ahab became complicit in her wicked actions, allowing her to wield significant power in his court. Jezebel's unrelenting efforts to establish Baal worship in Israel led to a direct conflict between the prophets of Baal and the prophet Elijah, one of the defining moments of Ahab's reign. Ahab's reign was marked by a series of confrontations with the prophet Elijah. Number 4 on this list is King Saul. King Saul, the first king of Israel, is one of the most complex and tragic figures in the Bible. His story spans from 1 Samuel chapter 9 through 1 Samuel chapter 31 and is marked by initial promise, military success, and favor from God, but eventually spirals into jealousy, disobedience, and self-destruction. Saul's life serves as a cautionary tale about how pride, insecurity, and a failure to fully obey God can lead to downfall. Saul came from the tribe of Benjamin and was the son of Kish, a wealthy man. He was described as a tall and handsome young man, someone who outwardly appeared fit for leadership. The Israelites, desiring to be like the other nations, demanded a king to rule over them, despite God's warning that a king would eventually lead them into oppression, as noted in 1 Samuel chapter 8. In response, God allowed their request and instructed the prophet Samuel to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. Saul's early reign was marked by humility and promise. When he was first chosen, he hid among the baggage, showing initial reluctance and a sense of humility, as seen in 1 Samuel chapter 10. His first actions as king demonstrated competence and military leadership as he led Israel to a decisive victory over the Ammonites, cementing his popularity among the people, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 11. During his early reign, Saul had several successful military campaigns. He was particularly noted for leading Israel to victory over the Philistines, who were Israel's most formidable enemies at the time. Saul's son Jonathan also played a crucial role in these victories, particularly with his bold attack on a Philistine outpost, which inspired the Israelites to rally and defeat the Philistine army, as described in 1 Samuel chapter 14. Saul's reign also included wars against other enemies, such as the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and Amalekites, expanding Israel's territory and securing its borders. However, Saul's military successes could not cover his growing internal struggles, which would eventually lead to his downfall. Despite his early successes, Saul's reign began to unravel due to his disobedience to God's commands. Two key events marked his spiritual decline. First, offering a sacrifice without Samuel. During a battle with the Philistines, Saul's army was demoralized and many soldiers began to desert him. Saul became impatient as he waited for Samuel to offer a sacrifice before the battle. Against God's command and the prophet's instructions, Saul took matters into his own hands and offered the sacrifice himself. This act of impatience and presumption revealed his lack of trust in God and led Samuel to deliver the devastating message that Saul's kingdom would not endure, as detailed in 1 Samuel chapter 13. Second, his failure to obey God's command regarding the Amalekites. Saul's second major act of disobedience came when God commanded him to completely destroy the Amalekites and all they possessed as judgment for their sins. Instead of fully obeying God, Saul spared King Agag and kept the best of the livestock, claiming he intended to offer them as sacrifices. When confronted by Samuel, Saul attempted to justify his actions and shift the blame to the people. Samuel responded with one of the most well-known statements in Scripture: "To obey is better than sacrifice." Because of his rebellion, God rejected Saul as king and sent Samuel to anoint David as his successor. After David was anointed to eventually replace Saul, tension between the two men escalated. David's victory over Goliath and his growing popularity with the people further fueled Saul's insecurities and jealousy. When the women of Israel sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands," Saul became consumed with envy. His jealousy turned into a murderous obsession. For much of the latter part of Saul's reign, he relentlessly pursued David, attempting to kill him on numerous occasions. David, however, remained loyal to Saul, refusing to harm the king, whom he still viewed as God's anointed. Even when David had the opportunity to kill Saul, he spared his life, demonstrating his own integrity and respect for God's authority. Saul's pursuit of David showed his deep paranoia and growing instability. He became erratic, suspicious of those around him, and isolated himself, even lashing out at his own son Jonathan when Jonathan defended David. At one point, Saul ordered the execution of the priests of Nob, accusing them of helping David, further illustrating his descent into irrational and violent behavior. In his final days, Saul's desperation led him to seek guidance from a medium, the Witch of Endor, after God refused to answer him through prophets or dreams. This was a direct violation of God's law, which forbade consulting mediums or spiritists. Saul asked the medium to summon the spirit of Samuel, and Samuel's spirit delivered a grim message. The Philistines would defeat Israel, and Saul and his sons would die the next day. The prophecy was fulfilled when Saul's army was defeated in the Battle of Mount Gilboa. Saul's 3 sons, including Jonathan, were killed, and Saul, wounded in battle, took his own life by falling on his sword to avoid capture by the Philistines. His death marked the tragic end of his reign and the transition of power to David. However, his refusal to fully obey God, his jealousy of David, and his reliance on his own strength rather than on God's guidance led to his downfall. Saul is remembered as a tragic figure who allowed fear, pride, and insecurity to dominate his life, ultimately leading to his destruction. In the New Testament, Saul's life is often used as a warning about the dangers of disobedience and self-reliance. His story contrasts sharply with David's, who, despite his own faults, was called a man after God's own heart because of his willingness to repent and seek God's will. In summary, early promise. Saul was chosen by God as the first king of Israel, and his reign began with humility and military success. Disobedience. Saul's impatience in offering a sacrifice without Samuel and his failure to destroy the Amalekites led to his rejection by God. Saul became consumed by jealousy toward David, leading him to irrational and violent behavior, including multiple attempts to kill David. Saul turned to a medium for guidance, further illustrating his spiritual decline. Tragic end. Saul died in battle against the Philistines, marking a tragic end to a reign that could have been much greater had he remained faithful to God. Saul's life serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of pride, jealousy and disobedience, and the importance of trusting in God's plan above personal desires. Number 5 on the list is Abimelech. Abimelech was a significant and notorious figure in the book of Judges, particularly in Judges chapter 9. Unlike many of the judges in Israel, Abimelech was not appointed by God. He was a self-appointed ruler who seized power through treachery and violence. His story highlights themes of ambition, betrayal, and the consequences of seeking power for selfish reasons. Abimelech's reign is often viewed as an example of how unchecked ambition can lead to personal destruction and devastation for those around him. Abimelech was the son of Gideon, also called Jerubbaal, one of Israel's most famous judges, and a concubine from Shechem. Gideon had multiple wives and 70 sons, but Abimelech's mother was from Shechem, making him somewhat of an outsider among Gideon's other sons. After Gideon's death, Israel once again fell into idolatry, and there was no clear leader to succeed him. Abimelech, driven by ambition, saw an opportunity to seize power. To do this, he approached the leaders of Shechem, his mother's people, and made a proposition. Instead of being ruled by Gideon's 70 sons, the people should choose him, their blood relative, to be king. To gain support, Abimelech received 70 pieces of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, a Canaanite god, and used it to hire reckless scoundrels who would help him carry out his plan. One of Abimelech's most horrific acts was the massacre of his 70 brothers. To eliminate any potential threats to his rule, he went to his father's house in Ophrah and slaughtered all of Gideon's sons on one stone. This brutal act of fratricide demonstrated Abimelech's ruthlessness and his willingness to do anything to secure his position as ruler. Only one brother, Jotham, survived by hiding from the slaughter. Jotham later stood on Mount Gerizim and delivered a parable often called Jotham's parable, which was a warning against Abimelech's rule. In the parable, Jotham compared Abimelech to a thorn bush that set itself up as king over the trees, predicting that Abimelech's reign would bring destruction both to him and to the people who supported him. After the massacre, Abimelech was declared king by the leaders of Shechem, and he ruled for 3 years. However, his reign was far from peaceful, and God sent a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, setting the stage for internal conflict and betrayal. The people of Shechem, realizing the oppressive nature of Abimelech's rule, began to turn against him. One of their leaders, Gaal, openly challenged Abimelech and sought to overthrow him. Abimelech responded with violence, crushing the rebellion and destroying Shechem in a brutal manner. He razed the city, scattered salt on it to symbolize its destruction, and burned its leaders alive in a tower. Abimelech's brutal actions continued to escalate, and his increasing paranoia and desire to maintain power led to further atrocities. His violent reign became marked by continuous conflict and bloodshed. Abimelech's reign of terror ended in dramatic fashion when he besieged the city of Thebes, which had also rebelled against him. As he attempted to burn down a tower in which the people of Thebes had taken refuge, a woman dropped a millstone from the tower, which struck Abimelech on the head, fatally wounding him. Rather than die at the hands of a woman, Abimelech asked his armor-bearer to kill him so that it would not be said that a woman had brought about his death. His armor-bearer complied, and Abimelech died, marking the end of his short and bloody rule. Abimelech's death was seen as divine retribution for his wickedness, especially the massacre of his brothers. God repaid Abimelech for the evil he had done to his father's family, and the curse of Jotham, his surviving brother, was fulfilled. Abimelech's violent and selfish ambition not only led to his own destruction, but also brought about the downfall of those who had supported him. His story illustrates the destructive consequences of ambition, betrayal, and the pursuit of power without regard for justice or righteousness. Abimelech's life stands in stark contrast to his father Gideon, who, despite his flaws, was used by God to deliver Israel from its enemies. Key lessons from Abimelech's story. Number 6 on the list is Haman. Haman is one of the most infamous villains in the Bible, particularly known for his role in the Book of Esther. He was a high-ranking official in the Persian Empire, serving under King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes. Haman's story is primarily one of unchecked pride, hatred, and a desire for revenge, which ultimately led to his downfall. His plot to annihilate the Jews, and the miraculous way in which it was thwarted, is commemorated in the Jewish holiday of Purim. Haman was an Agagite, which some scholars believe ties him to King Agag, the king of the Amalekites, who were long-standing enemies of the Israelites. This ancestral enmity may have fueled Haman's deep hatred for the Jewish people. King Ahasuerus elevated Haman to a position of great power, making him second in command over the entire Persian Empire, as described in Esther 3:1. This promotion gave Haman significant influence over the kingdom's affairs. One of the king's commands was that all royal officials should bow down and pay homage to Haman as a sign of respect. Haman's conflict with the Jews began with a single man, Mordecai, a Jew who lived in the Persian capital of Susa. Mordecai was Esther's cousin and had raised her after her parents died. When Haman passed by, Mordecai refused to bow down or pay homage to him, likely because of his religious convictions. Mordecai's refusal infuriated Haman. Haman's anger quickly grew into a deep-seated hatred, not only for Mordecai, but for all of Mordecai's people, the Jews. Rather than dealing with Mordecai individually, Haman devised a plan to wipe out the entire Jewish population throughout the Persian Empire. His hatred was so intense that it went beyond personal revenge. It became a genocidal plot against an entire people. To carry out his plan, Haman approached King Ahasuerus and manipulated him into agreeing to a decree to annihilate all Jews in the empire. He presented the Jews as a people whose customs were different from everyone else's and who did not obey the king's laws, suggesting they posed a threat to the kingdom. Haman even offered to pay a large sum of money into the king's treasury to cover the costs of the extermination. The king, trusting Haman, agreed to the plan and gave him his signet ring, allowing Haman to issue an official decree. A day was set for the destruction of the Jews, the 13th day of the month of Adar. The decree was sent out to all the provinces, commanding the citizens to kill the Jews and plunder their possessions on that day. The empire's Jews, including women and children, were now under a death sentence. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he was devastated and went into mourning. He sent word to Esther, who by this time had become queen, but had not revealed her Jewish identity. Mordecai urged her to intervene with the king on behalf of her people. However, approaching the king without being summoned, Esther successfully gained the king's favor, and after hosting 2 banquets for the king and Haman, she revealed her Jewish identity and exposed Haman's plot. Esther 7:3-6. The king was furious when he learned that Haman had plotted to kill Esther's people, and in his rage he had Haman removed from the banquet. Haman's downfall came swiftly and dramatically. When Esther revealed that she was Jewish and that Haman was responsible for the plot against her people, the king was furious. In an ironic twist, Haman was executed on the very gallows he had built to hang Mordecai. The gallows, which were 75 feet high, had been constructed by Haman after he was further enraged by Mordecai's continued refusal to bow down to him. Haman's execution was not the end of the story. Although Haman was dead, the decree to annihilate the Jews was still in effect, as it had been sealed with the king's signet ring and could not be revoked. However, King Ahasuerus, at Esther's request, allowed a new decree to be issued permitting the most wicked, cold and calculating person on this list is, you probably guessed it, is Judas Iscariot. Judas is one of the most infamous figures in the New Testament, known primarily for his betrayal of Jesus Christ. Judas Iscariot was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus. He was responsible for managing the group's money, acting as their treasurer. Judas Iscariot, as the keeper of the money bag for Jesus and the disciples, is described in the Gospel of John as someone who helped himself to the funds meant for the group. Specifically, in John 12:6 it says, "This passage suggests that Judas would take money intended for the group's common use, which was meant to support Jesus' ministry and provide for the needs of the disciples and the poor." By stealing from the money bag, Judas was engaging in acts of dishonesty and greed, even as he outwardly appeared to fulfill his duties. Context of John 12, 1, 6. This verse comes in the context of Mary anointing Jesus' feet with expensive perfume. Judas objects to this act, saying that the perfume could have been sold and the money given to the poor. However, John reveals Judas's true motive, his desire to have access to the money for his own benefit, rather than any genuine concern for the poor. This incident highlights Judas's greed, which eventually culminated in his betrayal of Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. 12, 6. Unlike most of the other apostles, little is known about Judas's background, though he is often referred to by his surname Iscariot, which could indicate that he came from Kerioth, a town in Judea. Judas is most known for betraying Jesus to the religious authorities for 30 pieces of silver. He identified Jesus to the soldiers with a kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane. This act of betrayal was prophesied in the Old Testament, especially in Psalm 41:9, where it speaks of a close friend who would turn against the Messiah. Judas's betrayal set into motion the events that led to Jesus' crucifixion, marking a pivotal moment in Christian theology about sacrifice, redemption, and the fulfillment of God's plan for salvation. While Judas is often vilified for his actions, the Bible presents a complex picture. Some passages suggest he was motivated by greed, as he often helped himself to the group's money. In other interpretations, Judas might have hoped to force Jesus into revealing his messianic power to overthrow Roman rule by putting him in a dire situation. The Gospel of John emphasizes that Satan entered Judas, indicating that his betrayal was influenced by a larger cosmic struggle between good and evil. After betraying Jesus, Judas experienced intense remorse and attempted to return the silver to the religious authorities, declaring that he had sinned by betraying innocent blood. In despair, he threw the money into the temple and hanged himself. The authorities used the silver to buy a potter's field, which became known as the Field of Blood. Judas's name has become synonymous with treachery and betrayal. His actions have been interpreted as part of God's divine plan for Jesus' crucifixion. Yet his choices remain a subject of theological reflection on free will, sin, and redemption. Some traditions suggest a hope for Judas's repentance or redemption in the afterlife, while others view his fate as one of eternal condemnation. Judas Iscariot remains a deeply complex figure, symbolizing both human frailty and the mystery of God's overarching plan in the story of salvation. Greed, power, and evil are interrelated concepts often explored in literature, religion, and philosophy as forces that can lead to destructive outcomes. Greed. Greed is an excessive desire for material wealth, status, or power beyond what one needs. It often leads individuals to unethical behavior as they prioritize their self-interests over the well-being of others. Greed is typically driven by insatiable ambition, leading to dissatisfaction and moral corruption. In religious contexts, such as Christianity, greed is seen as one of the 7 deadly sins because it draws people away from selflessness and towards selfishness. Power. Power refers to the ability to influence or control others, resources, or outcomes. When sought in excess, the pursuit of power can lead to manipulation, oppression, and the abuse of authority. People in positions of power may misuse it to serve their own interests, often to the detriment of those less powerful. Power itself is neutral. It can be used for good or evil. However, unchecked or absolute power tends to corrupt, as the individual holding it may become detached from ethical considerations or the consequences of their actions. Evil. Evil is typically seen as a moral force or behavior that causes harm, suffering, or destruction. It can arise from the unchecked pursuit of greed and power, leading to actions that violate justice, compassion, and goodness. In religious terms, evil is often depicted as a force opposed to good, such as Satan in Christianity, who embodies rebellion against God's will. Evil can manifest in cruelty, deceit, and violence, and is often fueled by greed and the desire for power. Interrelationship. Greed can drive individuals to seek more power, often leading them to compromise moral values, resulting in evil actions. As people attain power, they may become greedy for more, perpetuating a cycle of corruption. In essence, greed and power, when pursued selfishly, can lead to the manifestation of evil, creating harm and suffering both for individuals and society, and the ones you love the most. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up and share. If you haven't already, come on over and join our family by subscribing to our channel. May God bless you and all your endeavors. Thank you for watching.